Good morning, everybody. I am so thrilled to be here today with Felicia Chan, and she has generously offered to share her wisdom and work with the Living Resource Project, which is a compassionate communities initiative that reminds us that we all have what it takes to show up for the grieving and the dying among us on this journey of life, including death. And I am so inspired by fresh and creative ways to invite people to deepen their intimacy with death and grief. And that's exactly why I reached out to Felicia. So, Felicia, welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about the inspiring work that you do in the end of life space to support the dying and their people?
Yeah, I found myself in this space for the first time, hmm, probably close to 8 years ago. In my work as a photographer, primarily as a documentary photographer, I was invited to meet a family at BC Children's Hospital because a family from Saskatchewan was flown into BC Children's to have their baby, not knowing if the baby was going to be alive when it was born. And to this day, I don't know how we got connected, but that was my first experience in supporting a family in that space that is very vulnerable and uncertain. And I knew at that time how important that work would be moving forward. I think it gave me this immediate sense of how precious the balance of birth and death is in that, and how short life can be for some that experience it in that way. So I think my experience with that family really propelled me into thinking more about doing that work specifically in that space. And so now it's been 8 years, and probably for about six of that, I've been supporting hospitals and organizations in both the children years as well as the birth years, where if there are families that are going through stillbirth and end of life for children, I would be the photographer that comes in to spend that time, that remaining time with them in a voluntary role. Yeah.
It's, it's hard to know how to ask this in a way that it's just hard to know how to ask this. But as someone that works in the end of life space, not that there's ever a hierarchy when it comes to grief or loss, because there's not, but I can speak for myself. The idea of, like, you talk about this intersection of birth and death and children and end of life, even as someone that works in the end of life space, seems just like the biggest thing, like the worst thing that could happen. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm so curious about, like, what led you to the place 8 years ago where you were able to say yes to that moment. Can you pinpoint anything that gave you maybe a sense of strength or groundedness in the face of infant loss? It just seems like just such an enormously energetic space to be in.
I don't know if there's any one thing. I remember receiving that call and speaking to the mother at the time, and it was something I couldn't say no to.
Yeah.
She was so certain that she wanted any time with her baby,
Mm.
whether it was, if her baby was born um, alive or born still, she wanted any time she had with her child documented. I've been in spaces with lots of birthing families, but until then, I didn't know how fragile it could be, I could feel. And yeah, so that was that sense of how precious it was. It gave momentum to the work, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes so much sense.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you.
yeah.
So that's sort of related to the question I was going to ask you next. If you could share a little bit about the path that led you to the work today.
The path feels like it's always evolving.
Mhm.
uh, I don't know if there was very much forward looking in terms of a path. I think of it as more an invitation
Mm.
to what could be,
Mm.
meeting people, to meeting communities that are just as passionate and advocating for this kind of work, for me to come across those kinds of folks who feel as strongly about this as I do, or even more so. So I've been so fortunate to have already met lots of women, and I will say they're actually all women, or non-binary folks who have been working in the space and sharing their wisdom with me so that I can go back to the work that I do to be more aware, to be more sensitive, to be more compassionate and empathetic towards the families that I'm supporting. So the path is not clear,
Yeah.
if that makes any sense. So it's more like I'm open to things that show up in my life that I feel like if there is a connection that happens in my heart and in my head, I feel like, okay, this is something, this is a place that I'm meant to be or pursue at the time. And since we've met in person like it's been a couple of years, I think,
Yeah.
so many other things have shown up in my life that I'm drawn to, that is still doing work that is in the end of life space.
Mm.
So the path is not one. It's like meandering and amorphous. So it's like constantly changing, and I kind of love that feeling about it because it parallels the uncertainty of the life that we have. But yeah, it's very heart led.
I love that so much. I feel everything you've just said. And what popped into my head was a quote by Rumi that's like, walk the way and the way will appear.
Yeah,
And it's like I envision this staircase that's like the only stair that's visible is the one that's in front of you. And the rest is just, yeah, it's full of possibility. And it's like it's not present yet. You have to wait for it to appear, and it's dependent on so many things, but it's your heart that takes you there, and it's your path, right? It can
yes.
completely your path. Yeah. Oh. um do you want to share a little bit? You mentioned that in the last couple of years, a lot has come up in your path. Is there any things that are firing you up and exciting you that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think there's probably three different things I can share. The first one, which I may have mentioned, it was sort of the inception of things when I last met you. Um, I've been fortunate enough to work with Callanish Society, who is an organization based in Vancouver that works with folks living with cancer, and they hold a retreat, actually four retreats a year for anyone in that sort of part of their cancer diagnosis. So they go to retreat in this beautiful place just outside of Whistler at Brew Creek. It's all about bringing groups of people together, small groups, where they are supported through with therapy, with body workers, with food. And my role there was to photograph the food, because when we think about folks living with cancer, oftentimes they're going through treatment and their palates are suppressed, and they feel like they have to change their diet entirely and not allowed kind of the joy and flavors of the food that they're used to. So Callanish, a lot of the work that they do is kind of to turn that on its head, and they historically have had a cookbook that they cook with at Callanish retreats, but they are changing kind of the way it's presented by making people understand that they don't have to lose their love for food. It
Mm,
can still be nourishing and life-giving. And
mm,
so they make it a point for every season to cook with the food that, interestingly, at Brew Creek, there's a farm that is very much farm to table food. So they create menus around that, the 4 seasons that they're there. And I was there to photograph all the beautiful food that they make. And the pictures are just part of it. I mean, our idea is to make sure these beautiful plates of food that they make for the meals are visually appealing, but it's also how do you infuse the idea of life giving and nourishing through those photographs. So that's one part of the work that I'm doing with Callanish, and they're hoping to change people's perspective with food and relationship with food as they're going through their treatments and their journey with cancer. So that's a very interesting approach. And so that's taught me a lot as well, because I'm there with the counselors, with the body workers, with the cooks, and the therapists that are all supporting these people and speaking to the folks themselves who are there for their own very personal reasons, and how much the food has affected the way they think about life. So it's really, really
oh,
powerful. Yeah,
what an interesting little niche to
I
draw
know.
into. And it's just like almost like a lens through
Yeah.
which you can have this very different view. It's so fascinating.
So it's that again, that idea of like, yes, you're in a place with cancer that you just don't know, maybe you don't know what the future holds for you, but the food and the idea of Callanish is to challenge that perception of like uncertainty and not knowing by focusing on the present of how you can change your mindset, how you can change your relationship with things around you right now, so
Mhm.
that you're not, all the things that are really weighing heavy on you are kind of at bay for the moment. So it's
Amazing. And I think of food and I think of like from the moment a baby's born, they're put on the breast for nourishment. So food is so life-giving, but
yes,
it becomes so many other things. It connects us with our culture, it connects us with our families.
right,
Like when do you ever have a gathering where you're not eating something?
that's
And
right.
it's true, like those things disconnect as people's palates change. And I think of like really interesting interactions with people at end of life that I've had who really have a strong connection to food. And a lot of people have food as a love language, right? Like they
Absolutely.
care for their people with food. And I'll always remember this one woman in her final days that was like a matriarch of this Ukrainian family, and she couldn't eat and she couldn't cook. But a way of bringing meaning to her last days was having her tell me about her recipes. So she'd
Mhm.
tell me about her pierogies or her borscht, and she would just light up. And it's amazing to see how significant food is. And then you get into the pleasure of food
Mhm.
and how that can bring you into the presence. It's quite interesting.
Well, just as you were talking about, the family, the Ukrainian matriarch who's talking about her recipes at her end of days. Here's another idea for a project where you can work with families that want to leave that as part of their legacy, the food piece, the food, because it's such a strong love language for them at their end of days where they're sharing this and cooking this. And there's a project in it on its own, photography project in my head anyway. You're seeing different cultures and how food comes out so predominantly as part of their love language and legacy at their end of days.
Yeah.
There's the project.
There it is, done.
I know.
Felicia. Yeah.
My brain is going. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there's another one. The story goes, probably about 3 years ago, I was at one of these Callanish retreats and I got this email from a City of Vancouver programmer. And she said, I got your name from somebody else that you are a photographer who has worked in sort of end of life spaces before, and I'm wondering if you'd be interested in this project called death care in the community. And this is specific to the Downtown Eastside community. And so we have some funding to be able to create some programming around death and dying for the Downtown Eastside community. And I'm wondering if you would be interested in photographing um, some portraits for the folks who are interested in creating that portrait for themselves so that when they die, that would be the portrait that we can place, say, at Carnegie, for instance, because that is the heartbeat of the Downtown East Side for gathering. And immediately I was like, okay, what are the chances I'm at Callanish doing this work and then getting this email at the time? So this is what I mean, where when the next step shows up, there's nowhere else but to step onto it and say, yes, I'm going to just show you. It took us a while to actually be able to set up the portraiture. And I say it took a while because it's not so much a logistical setup as it is a trust building exercise. So it's been 2 years, and the programmers and I have floated the idea to the community, and not so many takers initially. And so we felt, okay, maybe that part of the programming needs some time with the people that live there, because taking photographs, taking that the word taking is already very power imbalanced. And so I knew that in creating these portraits, it has to be a collaboration. And I wanted them to change a language, and it's not so much taking as it is creating together. So I went to a few workshops where they were giving information and sharing information and asking feedback from the community of what kind of information do you need? What kind of preparation do you feel would be helpful for you to prepare for your own death and dying, so you have some autonomy over decisions being made for you. So I would meet some of the same people that would show up to these workshops and have conversations with them and have my camera with me and taking some photographs with them for them. But I wasn't making portraits. It was more the exercise of being present with them and building that trust and foundation. And now eventually we were able to formalize something at Carnegie, and I was able to set up a little sort of makeshift studio there, and I'll just show you some of the photographs we made together. So we had quite an interest, that so much so that I think we're going to do it again this summer. Just some of the pictures, they're pretty significant in the way that they've shown up and chosen to dress for the day. Like, it's so interesting to see that some of these people are, they're mostly in their senior years of life, and yeah, they're beautiful. It was so incredible to meet them and talk to them about their life and where they live and who their friends are, and what's important to them. And part of the invitation is for them to bring anything that was significant to them to the photo. And so sometimes it would be a necklace that was important to them. Sometimes it would just be a certain pose that made them feel very much like themselves, and their personality sort of oozing through. It was an interesting process for sure, because it's the making of a portrait is not specific to this group at all. It's always a collaboration in my mind, but because these are folks that are often marginalized, I wanted to see how else I can give them more space and time to decide how their portraits are made. So we just took a longer time in conversation, and I would show them my process, and then we would try and come to a very organic settling of who they are, and then I would be photographing as we're talking. And I wanted them to be comfortable, but I also wanted them to forget the camera was there.
Yeah.
So those are the portraits that we created.
Amazing.
It's really
So generous. and so collaborative and so necessary and so good.
Yeah, and so hopefully they're happy. I mean, these are the ones I ended up choosing. So I actually delivered the gallery, and the programmer brought each of them in, and they decided which one they liked the best. So I
Okay.
printed the ones they chose. So very much it was in their
Your
hands.
hand. Yeah. Yeah. That autonomy piece is so important. And like you said, the language, like taking, I never thought of that in relation to photos, taking a photo, as opposed to what the language you're choosing, which is like collaborating with you to create. Big difference there and so important. Yeah.
And as a photographer, sometimes running into people on the street with cameras, and maybe they call themselves street photographers, maybe that's what they're doing, but they're
Yeah.
essentially taking photographs of people on the streets, or very vulnerable population in our
Mhm.
city, without asking permission. And that you
Mhm.
know brings up a lot of feelings for me of exploitation. Like, it's just
Mhm.
ethically it's not right. And
Yeah.
so I think as photographers we have to be very aware of the language that we use and how we approach the creation of a photograph.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I really feel that too. And I think, even I think in the end of life space as well, vulnerable population, I think it's the intention that you go into the engagement with, but intentions don't always safeguard you from causing harm. But I think having an intention about sharing a story with a larger group for the sake of creating understanding and compassion, sharing wisdom is really effective, but it has to be done so delicately. I think there has to be this consistent awareness of, you know, what the intention is, and if you are really handling people's stories, images of people, because so quickly I think it can tip to that exploitive nature. And I see that quite often in the space that I work in. And it's, I think, something that it really asks us to have a constant awareness of how we are navigating, yeah, holding people, be it their stories or their faces or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to share that third.
Yeah, I was going to say we have three things. Yes, I'm
Okay,
on the
great.
edge of my seat here. What's the third? They're
So the
so
third thing
good.
is very new. So I've come into a role of another job because as a mother, we don't wear enough hats. Um,
No.
I know. So I was on kind of a I felt the transitionary energy very much when my youngest was in grade 7 and about to go to high school. And I felt like, oh, some things need to shift and I don't know what it is. And of course, again, this like thing appeared. I've been working with midwives in the community through photographing birth. So I've known some doulas, some midwives, and I know you know Megan Sheldon, who is a
Yeah.
wonderful friend of ours, and we've been working on a project with Sarah for stillbirth boxes and miscarriage bags that
Mm.
we offer up as part of the community building for families who are going through loss, specific to the North Shore of North and West Vancouver. And there are midwives who are working very closely with us to make that project happen and continue to happen. And so, through that network of beautiful women, one of the midwives and I were chatting one day, and she said that she needed some help administratively. And so, I found myself taking on this job as the medical assistant to her midwifery team, which are currently 7 midwives at Canopy. And so that is another role. Colleen Fulton and I were chatting, is that as a business owner for Canopy, she had this vision of how do we make this a more community feeling clinic? How do we serve the community as a clinic in a way that's different than sort of the institutional feeling of hospitals or care centers? Or she just wanted to change the way they were approaching care,
Mhm.
um, both as a midwife and as a business owner. And so we were bouncing ideas off about, okay, so how can we bring different kinds of care to close the gaps in women's health? And somehow the conversation about providing postpartum care came to, what would be really interesting is if we had mothers that are going through the first months of their life when they're trying to give life to this new life they've just given birth to, be in the same space as a seniors like care center. So then you can bring the two ends of life together, like to the start and the seemingly sort of the years remaining with these folks. So then you just think about the generational living that we have, even outside of that context. If a grandmother was able to live with their children and grandchildren, how much more life force they could bring in and meaning into their life. What if we were able to pair that on a community scale? So it's like, wait, what? So when conversations like that again show up very organically, I feel like there's this need to pursue that and see where it takes us, right? Sign me up. That idea is yet to be fleshed out. It's very much at its infancy right now, and we're hoping to bring more energy and more people. This idea of kind of postpartum weeks of a mother's and family's start to the folks that have had so many years of experience and life lived and are so eager to share that. And even whether they're cognitively aware or not, I think the visual of a senior seeing babies, like it just lights them up, right? So yeah,
That
if
is
we're able to
so
do that somehow.
needed. This weaving of life and death and
Yes.
young and old.
Yeah.
And like this is, and it's nothing new. This is how we are designed as humans to live, right? And it just shows how disconnected we've become from these natural ways of being. And I've been part of conversations on the other end of the spectrum with people that are dreaming into different types of care facilities here on the North Shore and
Yes.
considering integrating, like, for example, the staff that work at these places to live on site as well, and their children to live on site as well, so that there is more of this, it's not just this is where
Yes.
the old people go. And, you
Yes.
know, and I've seen these magical moments. I have two that come to mind. One was a long-term care facility. I was sitting vigil for a man. His room window looked over a schoolyard. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember sitting in this vigil room. He was no longer communicating verbally and, hours away from dying. But to hear the voices on the lunch hour of
Mm-hmm.
the children screaming and running around and being able to sit there in that moment and hold all that life-giving energy and be with that other transition just felt so, it made everything make so much sense to me and have that perspective. And I really feel like also for him. And I similarly was doulaing for a man who was dying in North Van, and his window also looked onto a children's playground. And those just are very much imprinted in my mind.
It's just hearing the midwives come to it of their own. You just know that there's a driving force within them when the conversation was taking shape, when
Yeah.
they're visualizing, and it's not my words, it's theirs, where they're like, what if you can have a physical space of this group of folks who've lived such a long and rich life with
Mhm.
stories, and design the space so that it's not compartmentalized,
Mm.
and have a gathering place in the middle, like a garden or wide open space of maybe shops or bookstore or library, like it just those very community oriented things. A music room where music's being played with babies and the seniors could come and listen to it. Like it's all of those things that enrich the senses, right? You just don't know whether they can see very well or hear very well, but it it tries to entice as many sensory parts that they have and are functioning to be able to engage with all the population that, from the young to the to parents that come with them, and continue experiencing that when typically you think when they're living in these facilities, they're kind of cut off from the
Yeah.
world in some way, right? Even though they're medically supported and people come to visit them there, but it's not often they get to kind of immerse themselves in the world in this way. So
Well,
I'm feeling very hopeful. It gives me a lot of hope knowing that there are practitioners and women and midwives out there that are thinking and have the heart to, like, the work that they do. I mean, I have such a big love for midwives, and the work that they do is so intense, and they're often burnt out, but they still have the energy and the passion to think beyond the work that they do to see how they can give back to the community. So that's kind of the optimism that it gives me and the energy that it gives me to want to contribute to something like that.
yeah, I feel that energy coming from you. It's really
Yeah.
neat to be around. Yeah, it's awesome. I'm really
Yeah.
excited for you and the opportunities that lay ahead. Yeah, keep me in the loop on that,
I
please.
will. I will.
Know how that unfolds. So I feel like you're being very humble, Felicia, because when you were talking about the three things, I'm like, I want to hear about Alua Arthur. I don't know this story. I remember contacting you for this interview, and you kind of off the cuff are like, yeah, sorry, I'm not in town right now. I'm hanging out with Alua, doing some
I'm not
NDOT
hanging
stuff.
out with her.
No, I'm
I
teasing.
will put it in
Yeah.
context. In my line of work as a freelance photographer, sometimes I'm engaged with TED, the organization that does the TED Talks. And TED comes to Vancouver once a year on the main stage. This is where everything is filmed. And so I'm working on their photo team, and Alua happened to be there that year. And so I was able to listen to her talk about her work. So when I was listening to it, the first name that popped into my head was, I gotta tell Tracy about this. That's it. That was the connection. And so immediately I texted you.
Oh, so great. And for those of you listening, Alua Arthur is just an outstanding human being who is a death doula, does a lot of training for death doulas in the US. It's Going with Grace is her organization. And she has just written a best-selling book called, I think it's called Perfectly Briefly Human or Briefly Perfectly Human. I'm sure if you Google, it'll come up. That's amazing that you were able to be in the same space with her. And she's just got so much energy and passion for this
Yes.
work and is such an amazing communicator, truly. That's great.
I felt very privileged to be there.
Yeah, I'm sure. And she always rocks her outfits too,
I
doesn't
know. I
she?
know.
She's got colors here and jewelry
Yes.
there. And
Which
yeah,
is beautiful, right? You think
yeah.
like, and doing the end of life work, color, life.
Yeah.
Let's keep that vibrancy and that energy
Yeah.
going.
And she balances that with this sacredness as well. It's very grounded in the importance of these moments, and yet there is this levity that is really supportive. I had to ask about that. So the next question is, if you feel like sharing a story about the work that you do, maybe a story of a client or a situation that surprised you or deepened your understanding about the end of life journey.
Yeah, one of the families that I've worked with for many years, they have hired me once every 2 or 3 years. They've hired me to come and document their day in a life, and they live in Minnesota.
Mm.
So I would spend the day with them, and I've documented their life probably for 6 or 7 years now. And the previous request, hopefully not the last, was for me to come down and spend the day with them, not in Minnesota, but in Maryland, because her father has received a cancer diagnosis that's final, so that's terminal.
Mm.
And she wanted me to document their time together, his time together with his grandchildren and her and her husband. So she has 3 boys, and they have a very special relationship with their grandfather. And she just wanted me to do the same work that I do with her family, but including her dad. What I hadn't appreciated is, and this is my premenopausal brain because I can't remember his last name. His first name is Roland. He is a TED speaker. And his life's work is about looking into the psychedelic drugs and how it can alter your mind and body and perspective. And the sort of latter years of his research is all about how that is important for people that are going through chronic or like terminal diagnosis.
Okay.
And so he's decided, because he's where he is, and it wasn't because of his diagnosis that drove him to do the work. He was doing that work already.
Mhm.
And so he's taken that set of beliefs and applied it to his own personal journey and where he is in his season of life. And so he's decided not to take any treatment for cancer, and he just wanted to live his life as aware as possible. And so that's him experiencing firsthand his research. And I was able to be there to document his time with his family. And then I think it was about 8 months later he passed.
Mhm.
But I hadn't grasped the importance of the work that he did until I met him. So it's just interesting that he's pushed so much in his life for people to choose another way to be going through something really painful or chronic by way of thinking of not the medication, but going through these psychedelic options to help go through life. Yeah.
Fascinating. It's funny
Yeah.
how at this time in this culture, it's almost like you get treatment. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you get a diagnosis and you take that medical route.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see more people saying, well, wait a second, is that the best route?
Mm-hmm.
And one family comes to mind where there was a young man with a terminal diagnosis that came very suddenly. It was a routine colonoscopy, and it's boom, you've got 3 months. And those 3 months were spent pursuing treatment. And I'm not saying that's a wrong decision. It was very much treatments and side effects and in and out of hospital. And just those types of situations make you wonder, what if people felt more empowered, if there was more conversation about that different way? But just to have these options, like it doesn't always have to be, or it can be both. It can be medical and
Yes.
and it's just it's interesting. What interesting insight that must have been to, like you say, this is that man's life's work, and to be witness to him living it out.
Mm-hmm. So many times during the day, there were moments when he was sharing. They had a time in the evening after dinner where they put on these old videos that he had filmed of my friend when she was a baby, and watching the faces of her boys watching that when their mom was their age. It's these little touchstones. He had gone through his archives and wanted to share this video with his family.
Mm.
It was just so beautiful.
What a gift to those three boys.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story of Roland and his family and your friend. All right, I've got another one for you, Felicia. If there was one thing that you would like the dying and their people to know, what would it be?
I think this answer changes quite often depending on where I'm at. Right now, I would say to take the time to slow down, even though you feel like time is running out.
Hmm.
Find ways to intentionally slow the time by being present with the people that are in that transition, and so that you can be intentional about the decisions that you're making and the time that you're spending with them. And don't do that alone. Do that together.
Hmm. Thank you. So, Felicia, looking to the future, what are you dreaming into if you think of what is needed in the realm of you work, the realm that you work in? So, how do you see us perhaps meeting death with more acceptance and grace?
I think we do so much of that acceptance and grace, or are wanting that in our personal family unit when that happens, when a death is imminent. But I would love to see that there's supports in place. And I don't mean, I mean, I want that from an institutional point of view, like, you know, in terms of government and policies to work in favor of that happening. Because oftentimes when we're in the family unit, we're left with holding all of that on our own. And so it feels a bit siloed.
Mm.
And because I'm already inspired by the women that are pushing the envelope doing this work, including yourself and Megan and Emily Boodle and Nayo, you know, all of these women, they deserve all the attention in the world in order to change the bigger scale things so that we don't feel so alone in doing that.
Mm.
That's what I'm hoping for the future, is that this this force, this very determined force of breaking down the sort of perceptions of death into more gentle death care, which is what you guys have been preaching for many years now and the work that you do. I want it to be more mainstream. I want it for us to talk about it more openly, just like anything that has stigma needs to be
Mhm.
broken down by gentle and open conversation,
Mm. Thank
for starters.
you. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
you're welcome.
Thank you so much for being here. Before we say goodbye, though, I
Okay.
have my little gratitude card deck. This is from the School of Life. Um, as a photographer, Felicia, I think you'd really love these cards. There's two little sets of them inside, and they have just the most beautiful images on them. So I'm going to give them a little shuffle. And when we do talk about death and grief, it's really nice to balance that conversation with the gratitude. And so we'll pull one of these cards here, see which one's going to jump out today. It's going to be this one. So it looks like the image of a woman. It looks like maybe a subway. And on the back, it says, "We can, with complete impunity, fantasize about the people we can't have."
Hmm.
How does that land with you? I'm curious.
Hmm. My grandmother comes to mind first.
Mm.
Both grandmothers. I find as I age, I speak about them more to my children. So that would be their great grandmothers. I think this is very natural to feel as you age that you're voicing the things that your parents told you, your mother told you to your children, to impart that, like, things that are relevant to. You're like, wait, I'm turning into my mother. And the things that her mom told her is now passed down to me that I'm passing on to my girls. So there's that,
Mm.
I guess it's more gratitude for awareness of
Yeah.
that happening. And instead of maternal relationships that aren't always perfect, to be kind of like, ooh, really? Did I just say that because my mom used to say that to me? Instead of that sort of reaction, it would be more like, okay, there is a connection there
Mm.
down the matriarchal line. And being curious about why that happens. So gratitude in the sense of curiosity and openness to connection. That's what that picture brings up for me. Isn't
Yeah.
that weird?
No, I don't think so at all. That's very
Where my head
beautiful
goes.
and profound and very human. I put you on the spot there, but thank you.
Yeah. No, it's fun. I love these sorts of explorations.
Yeah. Well, I'm so grateful for you and for you offering your time to the Living Resource Project. And for those of you that want to get in touch with Felicia, her contact info is in the show notes. And yeah, I really hope you have a beautiful day. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.